Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good late night, depending on where you are in the world. And do you think we're jumping the gun on year-end holidays? Well, let us know about that. Today, I don't expect to get a whole lot of interest from folks just looking at that topic. And also be aware, it's going to get a little bit technical. But here's something that you need to know. If you make it into your 90s, you're very likely to have some version of this. You see, pulmonary artery hypertension is also very much wrapped up in a thing called right heart failure. And the most common cause of right heart failure is left heart failure. Now, what does that mean? Well, the left heart pumps to the body, the brain, the body. The right heart pumps to the lungs. If the left heart starts having some failure, the blood starts backing up into the lungs. And if the blood starts backing up into the lungs, then you start getting into right heart failure. So if you ask a cardiologist, most of them will say, you know what, this is just incredibly common once you get into your 80s, 90s. And people will say, wait a minute, heart failure, I don't know anybody with heart failure. Well, yes, you do. Heart failure is sort of like prediabetes, diabetes, atrial fib, and several other things. The medical community has just not been smart enough to recognize the early metabolic level problems. They've only been able to recognize really serious, more end-stage problems. In fact, if you look at, there's a classification system for heart failure called New York State Heart Failure Classification System. Stage 1 is entirely asymptomatic. There are no symptoms. So guess what? A whole bunch of people watching this show right now have heart failure, stage 1, and have no clue. And yes, there are a lot of people that do have acknowledged and diagnosed heart failure. So again, it's sort of like that issue with prediabetes, with atrial fibrillation, several other things. You've got subclinical or silent problems going on and may not even know it. Now, we'll talk a little bit more deeply about pulmonary hypertension. The one we're going to cover today is a little bit different. It's not the most common kind. In fact, it's a fairly uncommon kind. It's where the pulmonary arteries themselves, just out of the blue, for usually genetic reasons, just start overdeveloping, creating hypertension in that space, pulmonary artery hypertension. But again, one of the major reasons for bringing this up is to cover the discussion that I just had, especially if you're watching this channel and you're following the advice on this channel. You're likely to make it into your 80s, 90s, and 100s, and maybe more. And if and when you do that, you need to start beginning to think about, okay, I've made it through my 60s and 70s, and I've avoided heart attacks, but I'm going into more of a slower. A heart attack is an immediate catastrophic heart or pump failure. But then if you avoid all of that immediate catastrophic heart or pump failure, then you need to start looking at slowing down the old death by 1,000 cuts kind of thing, where you get debilitation of a slowly developing heart failure. Again, I'm not going to go much deeper on that yet. Let's talk a little bit more about the channel first and the kind of content that you can get on this channel. Basically, we're here to help save lives. By far the most common cause of death and disability in our world is not guns. It's not car wrecks. It's not missiles. It's not COVID. It's cardiovascular disease. And by far the most common cause of cardiovascular disease is problems with our glucose or carbohydrate metabolism, undiagnosed prediabetes. Just like I was talking about with the undiagnosed heart failure related issues. So what we do is we cover topics that that circle around these areas to help people understand more about cardiovascular disease, how to detect it early enough to prevent any of the symptoms or problems associated with it. And if you've already gotten into symptoms and problems associated with it, like if you already have plaque, how to manage that and stop that in its tracks so you don't become yet another statistic of cardiovascular disease. So here's some of the topics we've covered recently. Is artificial intelligence the new way to detect plaque? AI is getting into everything, isn't it? I will give you a quick hint, a quick spoiler. It's not quite there yet, but it's getting close. Another topic, low-dose statins for cardiovascular inflammation. Really, I've had, whenever I mention that, I get these people, and even when I don't mention it, I get people saying, wait a minute, doc, you say this over and over and over again, and you always talk about looking at the evidence in the science. Well, show us some of that science so I can give it to my doc. Well, that's exactly what we did just a couple of weeks ago. If you go on YouTube and you talk about health, you're going to get a lot of questions about supplements. I get a lot of questions about supplements. The reality is that there are a lot of supplements that have data that support their use. But again, you get a lot more opinions out there about supplements than you get real data. So we tend to cover the real data. And just unfortunately, most opinions tend to be colored by how they make their money. So we cover a recent antioxidant that was put out there and really did show some good data. But they didn't tell you that it also showed some very scary data too. So those are the kind of things that you can get on our channel. Now, we have a core curriculum, and that's the stuff that your doctor usually doesn't know. I mean, I'm not making this up. I'm not trying to complain about other docs. I am a doc, and I've made a living out of hiring and supervising docs. Docs are just like everybody else. Most of us want to do a good job. Docs are very busy in this boomer area, in the boomer era where we've got a lot of people who are aging into the ages of chronic diseases. Unfortunately, things like diabetes are the archetypical problem where we saw it and we understood it when it was like blood sugars of 2, 3, 4, and 500. But there's just not a lot of evidence out there, or there's plenty of evidence. There's not a lot of knowledge out there about more subtle metabolic derangements, the subtler versions. So there's plenty of information. There's just not a lot of knowledge. And that's what this is about. Giving you that knowledge where you can understand the more subtle time periods where you can prevent those outcomes. That's what this is all about, is preventive medicine. So 3 key areas in this space: insulin resistance, prediabetes, diabetes. Find that out before you've got tissue damage. This one problem is the number one cause of blindness, of kidney failure, of heart attack, of stroke, of dementia. And yet 2/3 of docs don't know how to diagnose it, let alone manage it. And again, that's not a statistic that I'm just making up. that it's not my opinion. It's research data. It comes from research teams at Hopkins, at Harvard, Mayo Clinic. They all say 2/3 of docs don't know how to diagnose this problem, let alone manage it. There's another component here, which is more important than LDL. Docs still haven't figured that out for the most part, and that's cardiovascular inflammation. This course, a couple of hours, and you will know more about cardiovascular inflammation than 99% of doctors. And then there's the classic plaque. Hey, doc, I've got my brother-in-law or my Uncle Jim, who I looked like in the family, had a heart attack. Can we just do a stress test and make sure I'm not going to have one? That's a classic statement, and it's a classic failure in terms of not only the patient, but the doctor as well. Stress tests are not the way to predict a heart attack or rule it out. There are much better ways. And that's what this curriculum's all about. If you're interested in our content and you want to contribute, again, we're saving lives all over the world. You'll see those in comments routinely on the channel and on the YouTube Live components. If you're a YouTuber, join the channel. Help us get that life-saving information out there. If you're not so much a YouTuber, but more of a Locals or Rumble person, we've got Locals and Rumble presence as well. We're starting to get patients coming in from those platforms. We'll talk a little bit more about subscription plans later. And again, that's what our book is about, the comment that I mentioned before. A stress test is not the way to predict a heart attack. We've talked about our chronic care management program. We've got it up, we've got it rolling, we've got it piloted, and it's an adjustment. It's an adjustment for the patients. It's an adjustment, for our team. But it has been shown in terms of health evidence, in terms of research, people that participate in this program end up healthier and end up going to the hospital less because they're healthier. What is this program? It's very simply a program where you stay in touch with your doctor's office much more often. Now, does that mean you're having a 1-hour visit with the doctor every week? No, it's like 45 seconds, 3 times weekly. You just fill out a couple of quick components on an app or an email, and it becomes really clear really quickly. Yep, I'm watching my weight. Yep, I'm watching my my exercise. Yes, I'm taking my medications. In other words, it's a quick follow-up on your health behavior. Now, we're getting more and more interest and comments about what I eat. This may not look, I don't know if you think that looks good or not. Anyhow, these are some of the common foods. Pollock is I think it's a northern fish. It's a northern white fish, and I make that. I just grill it with butter. Put it on salads or just eat it alone. There are one thing that I end up talking about with a lot of folks is keto breads. I've gotten to the point where I just don't eat bread that much, period. And because when I stopped eating bread, 8 years ago, there just wasn't a lot of good low carb bread out there. If you look on Amazon, there's several types of bread now. This is one of them. I'll occasionally have a panini with that, and it's really good. It's just that I've lost my taste for sandwiches. You don't get a whole lot lower carb than cheeses. Dairy products, milk, for example, has a lot of carb in it, but once you ferment that milk and turn it into a cheese, very few carbs. So we're going to start talking. We're developing a channel for doctors. It's the Physicians Prevention Network. It's going to be supported by a channel like we do here. It's also going to be supported by a website like we have for our patients. And one of the things we're going to ask you to do is consider referring your own doctor to this, because we get so many complaints that my doc doesn't know any of this stuff. I know your doc doesn't know any of this stuff. That's what I do for a living. I teach doctors for this. So we'll talk about HEDIS for a minute and A1C on this item. Now, why are we talking about that? You're going to look at this and say, whoa, this is just out of control, and they're calling this A1C control. Yeah, the typical patient, the typical subscriber to this channel is in far better control than the typical patient walking into the typical doctor's office. HEDIS stands for the Healthcare Effectiveness Data and Information Set. What is it used for? It's used by CMS and some other groups to judge the quality of a doctor's performance. You know, it used to be, and most docs still think that they function this way. If I do a good job, head down in the exam room with that one patient, then I'm a good doctor. Well, no, you're not, because you're not a good doctor until you're looking at those patients, even that don't even get into your office, the patients that don't get an A1C, your complete patient panel. In other words, population medicine. That starts getting into preventive medicine. It's much, much more difficult than, how's our blood pressure today, Mrs. Jones? So again, I'll go back and we'll mention how out of control, quote, control is for HEDIS. And it starts to give you some perspective on how bad things are in the standard, the most common, your typical doctor's office. A1C, HEDIS. For members, this is one of the quality measures that they look at. This is a tip sheet that came out from Hopkins this year. A1C control is less than 8%. Oh, my Lord. A1C poor control is greater than 9%. Again, you see what I'm talking about here. That's how bad it is in the rest of the medical world in the US. And that's in the US. A1C is no longer a testing indicator if multiple tests last A1C levels rule. Now, one of the first thing is no longer a testing indicator. Just make a comment. As I've said multiple times, and as the American Association of Clinical Endocrinologists have said, they're right. A1C is not a great way to make a diagnosis of diabetes. Unfortunately, most doctors do that. Almost all doctors do that. You need to do something more like an oral glucose tolerance test, or even better, a full-blown insulin survey. But let's go on. Let's get a little bit deeper. And again, get a little bit out of our world, where it's a preventive population-based world, and into a world where there's not been much population-based care. There's not been much prevention. You just wait till the patient comes in and try to deal with whatever they complain about, and not have any of your own agenda for the patient. A1C is no longer a testing indicator if multiple tests, the last A1C level rules. In other words, what you want to know is, what was their last A1C level of the year? That's how HEDIS, that's how Medicare Advantage, that's how CMS, that's how groups judging the physician's practice operate. And that's appropriate. That's exactly what they should do. If elevated, depending on your definition of your term elevated, it must be repeated prior to the end of the year. Now, documentation is key. This may sound elementary, but you need to get deeper into the standard healthcare environment before you don't understand why would they not write it down. Quite often it gets written down, but just lost. Just as an example, labs should be scheduled prior to the patient appointment. Therapy must be adjusted to improve A1C. And this is like coming from Johns Hopkins, and it's supposed to be, really, really good, really smart. Sounds kind of elementary, doesn't it? Other measures, retired measures, or comprehensive diabetes care. won't get into that. Antibiotic utilization, there's been massive overuse of antibiotics. And again, won't go down that bunny hole for right now. The revised measures on the HEDIS tip sheet, CDC has separated things into hemoglobin A1C control for patients with diabetes, blood pressure control for patients with diabetes, and eye exams for patients with diabetes. Are you getting a theme here? You remember why, this channel seems to be more about diabetes than anything else. Once you start getting into population-based medicine, once your doctor starts actually focusing on what's really killing and disabling his or her patient population, you start hearing more and more of this diabetes that, eye exams, blood pressure, A1Cs for patients with diabetes. And then once, as a national group of doctors, the profession starts getting that, they're going to then start looking at patients with prediabetes. But that's going to be a long way off. They're looking at things now like language diversity, race, and ethnicity. Stratification is required for controlling blood sugar, A1C, colorectal cancer, well care visits, prenatal visits. In other words, now they're starting to say, look, there are enough people speaking enough different languages where you need to start having some components for dealing with that. Now, again, you may have a disconnect. It's like many things in prevention that don't make sense until you dig deeper. I keep saying, don't use A1C to make a diagnosis of diabetes or insulin resistance. I'm not alone. The American Association of Clinical Endocrinologists, easy for me to say, clinical endocrinologists says this as well. It shows the obvious importance. Now, why are we focusing or is HEDIS focusing so much on A1C? A1C is actually very good for diabetes control. So once we have diagnosed your diabetes using using OGTT or insulin survey, we then calibrate your A1C to see how high or low you tend to run for a standardized level of insulin resistance. If you take care of this issue, you remove the biggest killer and disabler of them all. So that's why there's so much focus on it. So Gilbert, if you'll give us the water ball, we'll talk about pulmonary artery hypertension. So many people saw that title today, and maybe I should have rephrased it. I thought about, how can we make more of a clickbait, more of an attractive kind of title? Because who's going to care about pulmonary artery hypertension? Who's ever heard of it? Who knows anything about it? And the bottom line is not very many people. So unfortunately, not a whole lot of people are going to take a look. We actually have a surprisingly high number of people on right now. But again, let's go back and talk about this for a second and put things in perspective. There are a whole bunch of things that cause right heart failure. Right heart pumps to the lungs, the left heart pumps to the rest of the body. Now, by far the most common cause of right heart failure is the left heart failure. In other words, the left heart failure happens. The lungs get full of liquid and blood. They stay full month after month, year after year, decade after decade, and the right heart just gets worn out, pumping against too much resistance. Now, let's go back to the very beginning. So what's the most common cause of left heart failure? Anybody guess yet? Heart attacks, loss of a big chunk of that pump tissue in the left heart from a heart attack. And we know what the most common cause of a heart attack is. But what about death by 1,000 cuts in this perspective, where you get tiny microscopic blockages of capillaries and arterioles in the tissue of the left heart. In other words, if you were to look at the tissue of the left heart with a microscope, it might look like Swiss cheese in terms of all these tiny places that are that have had tiny microscopic clots and have lost their blood supply. That is a typical presentation of left heart failure. And again, if you ask a typical working cardiologist, he or she will say, yep, you know, once you get to your 90s, most people have this kind of problem. They're getting into right heart failure because they've had left heart failure for 20 years, the first maybe 30 years, because they didn't know it. So, you know, you start taking those time periods back and you start thinking from a preventive perspective. A lot of people on this channel, a lot of people watching are in their 50s, 60s, 70s. You are actually in a time and a space where you may be having a little bit of left heart failure, probably New York State, if you're not aware of it already and your doctor hasn't diagnosed it. Maybe it's that New York State stage 1 where it's asymptomatic. Again, where could that be coming from? Well, what's the number one cause of cardiovascular disease? Diabetes, prediabetes. So now you start to walk things backwards and begin to understand this is very important. Now, this, or at least right heart failure is, because it's sort of like the final, the Grim Reaper, the final thing that takes us out. The final thing that takes a lot of people out, and the final thing that most doctors thought of as the Grim Reaper was pneumonia. That's in more of an acute phase, but it's rapidly becoming right heart failure. Now, let's get a little bit deeper, though. What we're talking about today is not so much that type of right heart failure. There are other things that cause it. I just said the most common cause of right heart failure is left heart failure. There are other causes, and we'll talk about another cause in just a minute. We're talking about primary pulmonary arterial hypertension. So this is not something that you see. I mean, this is not the typical right heart failure that I've been talking about. This is a little bit different, and there's some significant breakthroughs in this specific area. This primary pulmonary arterial hypertension is a group of disorders with where you get growth of the resistance of the pulmonary artery itself, the artery that pumps from the right heart into the lungs. It's still not, it's not rare. It hits up to 50 patients per million. Over time, it causes enlargement of that right ventricle, the right heart. And you know what? People say, well, once you get past these levels of asymptomatic heart failure and you get into heart failure, really it's all about drugs. That's what doctors tend to think as well. But if you go back and you actually look at the clinical trials associated with heart failure, whether it's heart failure caused by this primary pulmonary arterial hypertension or the standard run-of-the-mill left heart failure, still, lifestyle is king, believe it or not, and especially keeping your weight down and getting that exercise. But let's go back to primary, more of a genetically driven pulmonary artery hypertension. This was in the New England Journal last year. There's a new drug, and it is having an impact. Now, this gets into what's causing that primary resistance, increase in resistance, that primary increase in the pushback, the resistance, the flexibility or lack thereof of the pulmonary arteries. Well, there's a dysfunctional signaling pathway in a again, genetically driven way that the proteins are laid out. Sotatercept is a novel fusion protein. It binds activins and growth differentiation in an attempt to restore balance between growth promoting and growth inhibiting things. Again, there's only a couple of slides of this for those of you who are not interested in this specific topic. And we'll get back out into the broader world of heart failure and what that means. The sotatercept, it was a 24-week multi-center trial. They randomized 106 adults who were receiving background therapy for pulmonary artery hypertension. It's an injectable given subcutaneously. The primary endpoint was change in vascular artery resistance, pulmonary artery resistance. If you go through a few statistics, it was really clear. And in fact, just take a look at this. That is really clear. And one of the things that you see here is, okay, so this is vascular resistance, pulmonary artery. This is the placebo. This is a moderate dose of sotatercept, and this is a larger dose. Epidemiologically speaking, one of the things that you really do want to see is called a dose response curve. In other words, if you change doses of an intervention and that changes the level of intervention, that's a strong, very strong signal, strong evidence that the thing you're changing doses on is actually the thing that's changing here, not some randomized, some random other impact. So bottom line was the sotatercept was associated with decrease in N-terminal proBNP. You may have heard about that one. Also decreases in thrombocytopenia, increase in hemoglobin, items that you'll see with these original problems. It resulted in reduction of that pulmonary artery. So for those 50 out of 1 million people, this is a really, really big deal. For the rest of us, understanding this normal progression from healthy to insulin resistant to starting to get cardiovascular disease and inflammation, and then death by 1,000 cuts, or just large catastrophic cardiovascular events resulting in major loss of pump failure or pump function from the heart, progressing into, a weak, older, frail person who cannot move around very well because they're not getting good perfusion. They're not getting good pump function. So, yes, we talked about a fairly unusual type of problem here and a big new treatment for it. But it gave us the opportunity to think about something that's far more common and far more devastating. And again, much more of the end stage of what we're all trying to avoid now in our 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, when we're approaching our carb metabolism, saying, oh, wait a minute, I want to make sure that there's not problems with that metabolism leading to heart failure a couple of decades down the road. So that concludes our planned content. Now we'll go into an Ask Me Anything Q&A. If you'll give us the transition, Gilbert. Gosh, yes, still a surprising number of people, given the sort of esoteric nature of that topic. Dwight Baldwin, hi, Dr. Brewer. What are your thoughts on set point theory and settling point theory? I read about a contestant from The Biggest Loser who lost a lot of weight and then his metabolism slowed down. Yeah, I mean, read any of Jason Fung's book and he talks about that all the time. I think he sort of overdoes it. I'm a big Jason Fung fan. The bottom line is, yes, set point, there's no question that set point is an issue. Your body wants to be set where it is now. So when you make a change, let's say you lose 5 pounds, 10 pounds, until and unless you lock that in, and that's going to take usually more than a month, you're going to be your body's going to be very, very susceptible to going right back where it was. Now, Jason Fung's point about metabolics, the metabolism slowing down, is also related to exercise versus diet. He keeps trying. His point is, look, it's not the bank account theory. It's more of the carb theory. And he's right about that as well. The bank account theory says calories in, calories out. And so therefore you crank up the amount of calories out with your metabolism. You do a lot more working out, and you just decrease the amount of food. You don't worry about how much of that is carbs. And I would agree with him 100%. There's plenty of evidence that would indicate, yeah, you keep eating a lot of carbs, your blood sugar does this number. And when it goes down, you get hungry again. So you really do need to, it is a lot more. The endocrine theory of weight loss, the insulin theory, the insulin mechanism of weight loss, those are critical pieces to changing weight and losing weight. So I hope I didn't butcher that up too much. JMK, cardiologist Nadir Ali opines that Lp(a) is not causative when it comes to coronary artery disease. He says that Lp(a), like LDL, is a firefighter and not an arsonist during the atherosclerosis process. Your thoughts? Very interesting question. If you had asked me this question 4 years ago, I would have shaken my head and say, no, it's clearly an arsonist. I'm not so sure anymore. And here's one of the things that I'm getting more and more, I'm leaning more and more in that direction, but not just for Lp(a). And I think Nadir Ali's I think he's also said multiple times the same thing about LDL. LDL is not the arsonist, it's the firefighter. For those of you who don't get the analogy that we're talking about here, you've got a fire going on, damage is happening, and you see a bunch of firefighters around. Well, you think, well, the firefighters caused this fire. No, they didn't. They're trying to stop the fire. They're not the ones that started it. Now, as I continue to watch and deal with carb metabolism versus things like LDL level, I tend to lean more and more in Dr. Ali's direction. Now, I'm not completely there. He says, just like everybody else, I am somewhat of a fan of Ali, but I don't agree with everything he says. I've heard him say, the higher the LDL, the better. I don't agree with that. I don't think that LDL is causing the major problem. I do think that it's more of a bioindicator. Lp(a) also, for example, might be more of a bioindicator. So, both concepts might be wrong, that it's not the fire, it's not the arsonist, it didn't start the fire, it didn't create the damage. And maybe most of that damage was caused by carb metabolism related problems, prediabetes, diabetes. It also may not be a firefighter. It may not be something that's there specifically to repair the problem or stop the fire. It may just be a bioindicator. So what do you think of that? Robert Weiss, good morning from the North Georgia mountains. Your definition of high intensity interval training, what heart rate percent for how long and then repeated for how often? That's a really, really good point. That's like saying, what's your definition of effective exercise? If you're if you're somebody whose um, biggest form of exercise right now is walking in the mall, I don't recommend that you get to a heart rate of 135. Um, most 65-year-olds, I would say, so here you're going to hear me use absolute numbers and ages, and you're going to say, Ford, that doesn't really work. I want a percentage. And percentages are based on ages, right? But the point I'm going to make here is that that breaks down as well. I'm 65 years old, and like a lot of my patients, I routinely get significantly over 150, 160 or so in terms of my high intensity interval heart rates. Now, that's not appropriate for most 65-year-olds. Most 65-year-olds, it's more appropriate to hit into the 130s. So I don't think I can get any plainer or simpler than that. If you've done nothing but walking in the mall for the past decade, that's been your biggest source of exercise, I don't suggest you go out and try to do 10 intervals of getting your heart rate even to 130. So high intensity interval, your ceiling depends on where your floor is. Now, a couple of other things to acknowledge about this. What's the purpose for high intensity intervals? Well, what does it actually accomplish? Let's talk about that for a second. High intensity intervals actually deals with what may be the biggest issue with aging and insulin resistance. One of the things that we say with insulin resistance and the perception that we all tend to have is, like most things, a little bit too simplistic. We tend to think, well, there's these insulin receptors in the cell wall and they pull sugar out of the blood where high levels cause damage and pull them into the muscle or liver cell where they don't cause damage. So it's all about the function of those insulin receptors. Well, let's go back and look at a little bit more microanatomy. What do I mean by that? Well, microvasculature. What do I mean by that? Capillaries. What is the capillary richness of your muscles? So as we age, especially getting past 65, you start losing a lot of that capillary mass within your muscle tissue. And if you lose capillary mass, then you're basically losing the interaction space, the surface area that the insulin receptors that are in this muscle cell wall can use to pull that sugar out of the blood. In other words, maybe this is really more of an issue of surface area of capillary to muscle tissue. You see why I'm going in that direction when I start talking about high intensity intervals? That's exactly what high intensity interval work does. Now, how can you get high intensity intervals? Well, you can get them working on machines, going from one to the next to the next. What kind of timing do you want to do? Marathoners talk about a 5-minute intense phase of a interval. Well, yeah, that's true if you're a marathoner, but really what we're talking about, when you're talking about for prevention and health, disease prevention, and you're talking about pushing capillary growth, increased capillary growth to the muscle tissue, you really should talk about a second or at most a minute or at most 2 minutes in the intense phase, followed by about that same phase of very slowing down. And what's the purpose of slowing down? Slowing down is so you can recuperate, so you can charge back into that intense phase. Now, what is an intense phase? What percentage of your absolute max? We've already covered that. I'm not going to cover that again. But here's one thing I would say. You do want to get to where you're doing that. You're not able, people say, oh, when you're exercising, you want to do aerobics, you want to be able to sing or hum to yourself or talk to a friend. Well, that's light aerobics. That is not high intensity interval phase. You need to be for about a minute where you're doing that. And yeah, it's going to be, if you're a mall walker, you're not quite ready for that. But that's the long-term goal. Slowly build up, a personal record today, another personal record in a couple of weeks, another personal record. Get to where you can do that. Now, another question about high intensity interval training. Which ones do you want to do that for? You work out on a machine and get it in your muscles. You want it in your muscles, but let's think about muscle size and mass. I'm no Arnold Schwarzenegger. Even if I were, his arms are not his major muscle mass. His legs are his major muscle mass. So what I recommend is that you look for ways to create this intensity of working out using primarily leg muscles. So you got me started. As you can tell, I'm a really big fan of high intensity interval training. Now, a couple of other things. I can't quit, can I? A couple of other things about HIIT training. Start with, I hope you can't hear that car alarm going off. Start with 3 intervals per session. You can work up to 10. Don't go beyond 10 intervals in a session. And go usually to at most 3 sessions per week. I have people come to me and say, no, I'm doing them every day. Well, you're not really doing enough intensity if you're doing them every day and able to survive. You need to be pushing it. So if you're doing them more than 3 times a week, go back off to 3 times a week or twice a week, but ramp up the intensity, because that's what you need to be doing. That is what improves the microvasculature, the capillary density of your muscle tissue to improve your insulin response. So, gosh, if I go down that far down every bunny hole that comes up, we'll never make it through today. Let's go back. Brad, if your CGM indicates well over 100 consistently, can metformin help reduce? So, of course it can. If it does, the starting dose that I tend to use is 500 twice a day. You have to ramp into that. The most common problem is GI symptoms, maybe a little nausea, a little gas, maybe even diarrhea. That happens in about 20% of us. And in the vast majority, it's over within a couple of weeks. We don't really know exactly how metformin works. It's not urban myth. The reality, a lot of the known data would indicate, it decreases your liver's ability to create glucose out of glycogen stored in the liver. But there's also significant evidence that it changes the gut microbiome. And there's also significant evidence that the gut microbiome tends to drive this problem. You may have heard of fecal transplants. One thing they discovered was if they did a fecal transplant from someone who had diabetes or prediabetes, the donor ended up with diabetes or prediabetes. So how did I go down that bunny hole? Let me just ask you this question. Does that help you begin to understand the impact and the importance of that gas, nausea, potential diarrhea for the first 2 weeks when you start taking metformin? Because people that start taking metformin, people that have been taking metformin for a while, usually transition from that gut biome that's very insulin resistance driven to a healthier gut biome. So there's a lot of stuff that's going on in that space that, pardon the pun, that you might not have thought about. Rick Folia on low carb, high fat, intermittent fasting. I expect Kraft to say I'm insulin resistant because cells are happy running on fat and oil and don't need glucose. So insulin resistance on low carb, high fiber, high fat, insulin or intermittent fasting is a good thing, right? You know, Rick, it sounds like you're going down that path, that urban myth that if you withhold carbs or if you eat a whole lot of carbs or if you load carbs, that's really going to impact your, for the past 3 months, that's going to cause a change in your insulin survey. I did if I've gotten beaten up on that once, I've gotten beaten up on that 1,000 times. Patients will say, Doc, don't you know that you'll get artificial diabetes of keto diet? So we've gotten beaten up on that. We'll recommend that people say, take a 2 or 3 day hiatus from their low carb diet before they get an OGTT. But let me tell you, there's scientific evidence on that. It's New England Journal, 2 and 3 decades ago. They looked at that. And guess what? No, it does not impact if you've been going low carb or even keto for the past 3 months, that's not going to create an artificial diabetes or lack of diabetes on your OGTT. That's what the evidence would tell us. So yes, we can all have our theories, but why don't we get back to the evidence? Great question. Thank you for bringing it up, Rick. And as you can tell, that's like one of those other things. I've just been beaten to pieces on it. So I've got my issues and emotions surrounding that topic. Johnny Midnight. Good morning, Johnny. Going to the gym in an hour. Good for you. Noam Hulamutus. Noam, tell us where your family's from. Does hydrogen water reduce inflammation? There's a lot of folks out there that are making a lot of money on water, and they'll tell you they've got the right pH, they've got the right supplements to that water, they've got, there's just so many. Who was it? 50 Cent or somebody just made a ton of money off of water. Water is water. Dihydrogen oxide. That's what it is. And yes, there's, the evidence surrounding the health benefits of variations of water that people are making money on is just not that good. Look at the science, look at the evidence. Would you receive ozone therapy for inflammation? No, I would not. Again, there may be a tiny impact, but it's like, what's his name is attributed with this saying. I'm not sure it was him. These attributions become urban myth as well. But somebody once said, whether it was Albert Einstein or whoever, I think it's obvious enough to where probably a lot of people have said, if you find yourself in a hole and you're wanting to get out, the first thing is to stop digging. Now, why am I bringing that up? By far the most common cause of inflammation is carb metabolism problems. And the most common cause of that is aging. Yes, genetics are a big deal. And yes, body fat is a big deal. But when you look at those 3 big causes of inflammation, 2 of them you can't do anything about. Aging, you can't do anything about. Your genetics, you can't do anything about. Pardon the imagery there. That leaves the one thing. Body fat. So you can do something about body fat. So, and you can do something about the amount of carbs you're eating, especially if carbs cause your problem. No matter what you've been eating for the past 3 months, if you do an insulin survey and the insulin survey says you're carb resistant, insulin resistant, that means it's poison to you in certain doses. So why keep digging yourself deeper by ignoring the major drivers of inflammation and saying, okay, I'm going to take this special water, or I'm going to take an ozone treatment, and ignore the cause and keep digging yourself deeper? So thank you for that question. Again, a couple of interesting questions and items. Brendan Delane, good to hear from you, Brendan. Crestor and B3 pushed up A1C. I got it down to B3 is nice, and in both of those will do that. Depending on, I'd be curious regarding what level of Crestor you took. I got it down to 5.2 with carnivore. So if you're at a 5.2 with a complete carnivore diet, you have a lot of insulin resistance. Okay, so very low carb diet, less than B3. Don't understand that comment. Cholesterol went up to 220 and LDL up to 150. What did I do wrong? You didn't. Triglyceride 130 and HDL 58, BMI 21 as usual. So I would tell you this, it sounds like you've got a very significant amount of insulin resistance. Quite often people go up to significant levels of LDL. I did a video on this with a fella that's really doing a lot of work in that area, the cholesterol code. Oh gosh, I knew the name, and then I had a senior moment and forgot. Feldman. What's his name? What was his first name? Anyhow, his name is Feldman. David Feldman. Thank you so much, Gilbert. So Dave Feldman has a website called The Cholesterol Code, and he talks about how when you go low carb, a lot of people, their LDL will go up. And the reason for that is LDL becomes the currency or the boats that carry energy in terms of cholesterol and or fats, because you're not having any carbs to carry. And the car alarm is going off again, just outside my window. Sorry about that. Now, so I would suggest you look at that issue. There are a whole bunch of different things you can do with it, Brendan, assuming that this is not FH, familial hypercholesterolemia. Once you get over an LDL of 180, there's a good probability that you have FH. But again, if you've never had it except when you were on a very, very low carb diet, it sounds more like lean mass hyperresponder, which is the term that you'll see with Dave Feldman's group. And again, Dave's doing some research with a couple of academic researchers right now, and he's not the only one that's discovered this. This is not just an internet phenomenon. In Men's Health, Harvard Men's Health, I don't remember what year, the head of cardiology at Harvard was talking about how you can get a spike in your cholesterol associated with low carb. Now, again, I'm concerned to see your triglycerides that high on that low a carb. Brendan, you might want to come see us and see if we can help out a little bit. JMK 2921, do you routinely measure the BNP, brain natriuretic protein, blood tests to pick up subclinical heart failure and cardiovascular disease patients? I don't. I have gone back and forth on using that. And it's marginal. That's the issue. It's marginal in terms of what you pick up with it and what you end up doing in terms of overall positive impact. It's a great question, though, especially given the comments that I made today. Johnny Midnight, the LDL going up on keto is very common. Lean mass hyperresponder. Thank you so much, Johnny Midnight. Audrey Hurley, good morning from Texas. Off topic. Well, that's what Ask Me Anything's all about. Have you heard of mature postmenopausal women taking NR, NMN, experiencing periods again? I haven't. That's interesting. I don't know what else to say in terms of discussion. Thanks for raising the question, though. Johnny Midnight, triglycerides should be going down. Yes, I agree, Johnny. That's the concern. Well, I think I've already said all that. Not going to repeat it. Brad, is the triglyceride over HDL ratio more or less accurate than ApoB as a risk marker? More. It's far more important. You know, for reasons that we just saw, you can get huge ApoB as a result of a low carb diet. But triglyceride over HDL is a big, big deal. And I've got several videos. I've got a whole series on it. The reason it's important is that triglycerides rise as you've got more and more insulin. Insulin stops fat burning. HDL and LDL can both get chewed up when you've got bad carb metabolism. Here's what happens. The large, fluffy, healthy HDL population and the large, fluffy, healthy LDL population both have their cholesterol in the particle replaced with fatty acids when you get into a bad carb metabolism. When fatty acid laden particles, HDLs and LDLs, those large fluffy ones, pass through the liver, they get chewed up and metabolized, and you're left with nothing but the small, dense LDL and a major decrease in HDL. I used, in some of my videos, some of my deeper, longer discussions on triglyceride over HDL, I show you the actual impact on the population of HDL. It looks like a shark bite out of that bell curve. On the LDL curve, it just moves the whole curve down to the left. You don't get that shark bite look. You get more of just a shift. And unfortunately, Quest, in their infinite wisdom, stopped providing that bell curve. So I only have it in these 2-year-old studies now. How do we tell now? You just have to know the statistics. You have to know what you're looking for in terms of the lab results. Ricky the Gun One, good morning. What levels of blood sugar spikes are considered harmful? I'm blanking on her name. Blood Sugar 101. Somebody help me. She has a really good chapter on looking at what level of blood sugar is dangerous. And she would say 140 and above. And I think that is a pretty safe assumption. But you got to remember, it's also time under the curve. So a 5-minute, 15-minute spike of up to 170, 180, followed by a quick drop, is not that much of a problem. I'd much rather have that. I'd much rather go up over 200 for 10 minutes and come back down than consistently stay hour after hour, 2/3 of my time at 140. Okay, so I have an HbA1c of 5.0, but I recently wore a CGM and had spikes of over 200. I know that's too high. Well, yeah, it's not great. It means you're a full-blown diabetic. However, again, I think I've just said what I would say to you. I'm full-blown diabetic too. If I go off the reservation, I can get a significant spike over 200, but that doesn't last very long. Sugary carbs are so addictive. Oh, tell me about it. Hey, by the way, if you want to work on the sweet taste, the sugary sweet taste, try Gymnema, Gymnema. It's an old Ayurvedic medication. It's a natural additive supplement product. Now, don't do what most people do. They'll look up Gymnema and they'll get these little pills. Well, if you take a pill, how is that going to impact your taste? See, Gymnema actually has a molecule that blocks. It fits in. It looks to the sugar sweets receptor exactly like a sugar molecule, and so it fits in there and it blocks it. Well, if you take it in a pill, you're going to bypass your whole palate. So don't do that. I mean, I get it. I use it every day. I put it in my coffee in the morning, and I get these large things off of Amazon. Gymnema sylvestre. In the old Ayurvedic language, it's the sugar destroyer. Ricky the Gun 1. When taking an OGTT or craft insulin test, wouldn't your activity such as walking during the test affect the results? Is there a protocol to ensure a standard? Yes, I get that a lot. I even did that myself the first time. You've got a couple of hours to wait, and most people feel like, if I've got to do something, I'm focused on my health, I'll at least use a couple hours to walk. Those 2 hours are going to take the top right out of whatever spike we're trying to measure in this glucose tolerance or insulin survey. So yes, the protocol is go in, get your test, get your basal test, take your sugar, sit down, don't get up until you walk back in for hour 1 to get your peak insulin and glucose. Go back out, sit down in the waiting room. Don't walk out to your car. Don't walk around the block, because just walking is exercising your muscles. And guess what? Exercising muscles bypass insulin receptors and just pull blood sugar or sugar from the blood right into the muscle, thereby hiding carb metabolism problems. Thank you so much, Ricky the Gun, for bringing it up. It's a very, very common way of screwing up and getting a very deceptive OGTT. Investing hours and dollars in that activity and getting not worse than no results, wrong, deceptive results. A lot more problems occur from that than from saying, oh, I've got some artificial diabetes or some artificial lack of diabetes because of what I've been eating for the past 3 months. Fort Worth West Side, hit the like button. Thank you so much, Fort Worth. I only get the Facebook like buttons notice here, and we've only got 2. I don't get the notice on how many YouTube likes we're getting, or Rumble or Locals or any of that. Need more at-home tests. I agree. But you know what? There's a thing called Freestyle Libre, and that's really good. You can also get an at-home, a couple of versions of at-home OGTT and even insulin survey. One comes from, is it Meridian Labs? Another one comes from My Test or something like that. You're right. You do need more. But if you want to call Michelle at 859-721-1414, she can help you find that number right there. She can help you find some good home tests for these things. Per Johnson, my A1C, CRP is low, and APO ratio is 0.7. Is there any reason for OGTT in the new inflammation marker? Yes, there is. There's clearly, Per Johnson, you obviously don't watch this channel very much at all, because I probably say that at least 3 or 4 or 5 times per show. Don't use A1C. No matter what your C-reactive protein is, no matter what APOs and LDL fractionations or cholesterol fractionations, get the OGTT. I'm sorry, but until you do, I'm sorry to be rigid. I'm not being rigid. I'm just telling you the facts. Unless you get that, you really don't know what your numbers are. A fasting glucose is just a single snapshot. What do you think you're going to get from a snapshot as opposed to watching a movie? You can say, no, well, wait a minute, doc. A1C gives me the average over a whole movie. Yes, it does. But A1C is also based on your hemoglobin. So anything that impacts your hemoglobin is going to impact your A1C. That's exactly what the AACE does, the American Association of Clinical Endocrinologists, and they're right. So that's one area. I disagree with a lot of different medical standards committees. I don't disagree with the AACE on their statement that A1C is not a great way to diagnose diabetes. Bobby Ocampo, look, you've got a picture there. I haven't seen that before. Good to see you, Bobby. Hemoglobin A1C requirement of doctors in the Philippines is to maintain 7%. Well, depends on requirement or standard. No matter whether it's 7 or even 8%, those are both way too high. Thank you for sharing that, Bobby. Bobby's very much in tune with, he lives in the Philippines, makes a lot of comments, really good awareness of what's going on, helps us in terms of participation. Thank you so much, Bobby. Is there a drug to reduce hyperinsulinemia? Well, anything that reduces hyperglycemia also is going to reduce hyperinsulinemia. They don't make drugs to just impact insulin alone. Johnny Midnight, sugary carb abuse is a major problem in the US. Yes, Johnny, and I'm an addict. I've been an addict since I grew up in the Deep South, drinking sweet tea, eating apple pie and blackberry cobbler, and a lot of breads. JMK 2921, do you agree that cereal, and so therefore, that's why I get a dose of Gymnema every day to slow down that carb sweets addiction. JMK 2921, do you agree that the serial cardiac stress tests are a poor way to monitor the risk of 7? Of course I do. Yes. Well, maybe I shouldn't react that way. Maybe I should say thank you for bringing it up. That's one of the things that I talk about in my book. You get that over and over and over again, where people are just getting stress test after stress test after stress test, and they think they're okay. And it's like, I keep looking at my plumbing, I keep looking at my plumbing, I keep looking at my plumbing, and meanwhile, I'm digging myself deeper and deeper in terms of my metabolism, getting geared up for a heart attack. The vast majority, well, not vast, 2/3 of people that have a heart attack have less than 50% flow impacted by their plaque. Now, why does that matter? Why do I bring that up? Because you're not going to get anything positive on your stress test until you get more than 50%. Well, 2/3 of heart attacks occur at less than that. So yes, JMK, it's one of the biggest wastes. And here's another place where I would agree with, there are at least half a dozen American Heart Association, Board of Internal Medicine, standards committees that say stress tests are way, way, way overused. They are abused. So thank you so much for giving me a chance to go on that tirade. Fort Worth West Side, is there a standard curriculum that has to be taught in all medical schools in the US, or is it determined by each state or just the school itself? Well, there are national tests, the national boards, and there is school accreditation. So from that perspective, you can say, yes, there are standards in terms of what you teach. Is there room for improvement? No question. Johnny Midnight, health is wealth. I agree, Johnny. High blood pressure. Lucian, thank you for sharing. Letitia Adega, writing from Ghana. Thank you, Letitia. I appreciate you sharing that. My daughter visited Ghana and came away very impressed. In places where we cannot test MPO and LPPLA2, would you say that neutrophil and monocyte counts in white blood cell count profile is a good proxy? No, I would not. I would just go with HSC reactive protein and microalbumin creatinine ratio. And you should be able to get both of those. If not HSC reactive protein, clearly you should be able to get microalbumin creatinine ratio to determine cardiovascular inflammation. Excellent question, Letitia. Very impressed. I mean, that demonstrates a significant knowledge of this space. Unusual. Bambi Grage, good morning, Bambi. Long time no hear. Bart Robinson, when's there going to be a good home test for insulin syrup? Well, again, Bart, I got to ask you if you've tried that Meridian test. Again, we've got a lot of people that have done that. I've done it. I didn't think it was bad at all. Now, there's a lot of bleeding because you're using finger sticks, but you're going to be using finger sticks on any home test. Bart says, please remember to hit the like button. I appreciate that. Thank you so much, Bart. Bruce Nichols, are there some sort of list of physicians that follow your disciplines? I've not found a doctor local to me. You're not likely to. And the answer is no at this point, but we're working on it. As I said, we're working on building that network. Letitia from Ghana, a follow-up question. Are current lab reference ranges for neutrophil and monocyte counts optimal? No, they're, like almost every other, quote, standard in the lab results area. The labs give you standards by basically 2 standard deviations. Well, if 90% of your population is insulin resistant, for example, then you're going to tell a whole lot of people that they're, quote, normal and healthy, therefore healthy, just because they weren't 2 standard deviations away. So be very careful of using laboratory normals as meaning you're healthy. Laboratory normals don't necessarily mean you're healthy. Microbiome creatinine ratio, as I mentioned in your previous question, the labs aren't going to, they're typically going to say you don't have a problem until you get to 30 or above. The reality is for men, 3 to 5 and above indicates some inflammation. And for women, 13 to 15 and above indicates inflammation. So no, be careful about using that. And as I said before, don't just use absolute or relative neutrophil and monocyte counts anyway. There are too many other things that can cause variations. Bart Robinson, great question. Bruce, yeah, sorry about that, guys. But, I am working on it. And until then, you can check in with us telemedicine style. People say, oh, I can't see a telemedicine doc. You know something? I've been saying, yes, you can for the past 2 decades and longer. And I used to run MDLIVE, one of the larger competitors in that space. The problem with MDLIVE is that they're in urgent care. They have tended to be in urgent care. They've been trying to get into digital primary care or remote primary care for a long time, remote chronic disease management. I also work with another group called K-Health. Same thing. All of these groups that are in digital urgent care space are trying to get into digital primary care or remote primary care. That's what I do. That's what this channel is about. And people are finally starting to change. And guess what caused that? The pandemic. Bruce Nichols, Bart Robinson, does such a list exist? Probably not, Bruce, unfortunately. Maybe a low-carb doctor list or something. Yeah, even if you do a low-carb doctor list, you got to worry about, what they know about heart failure and some of those things. Lucian P, muscle loss from weight loss is an issue. Yes and no. I will say this. Yes, it's clearly an issue. However, and people say, oh, he's a cute little old lady, or she's a cute little old lady, he's a cute little old gentleman. Be careful. You don't want, you want to deal with muscle loss. However, also be careful with this. The assumption that a smaller muscle means, that it's all muscle mass and not so much muscle metabolism. And I'm going to go back to some of our original discussion on high intensity intervals. You can have very small muscles that are very metabolically active and therefore have a lot of capillary density. That's what you tend to see with runners. There's a fellow named Richard the Ant Hawthorne. His nickname is the Ant because he's had multiple world records for lifting multiples of his body weight, like an ant does. He's not an Arnold Schwarzenegger. I've done several videos on both Richard the Ant Hawthorne and Arnold Schwarzenegger. Both of them talk about reps. I'm driving myself crazy with reps. But the point behind that, Lucien, is, yes, I talk about muscle mass too, but think about it. It's really that capillary density within the muscles that's a big deal. And you get that from reps, and more reps. You know, we're talking about 50 to 100 reps in a session compared to your old standard of 12 to 24. 12 to 24 is not really going to do much for your muscle metabolism. Johnny Midnight. And you know I'm going to get haters on that comment because you've got a whole bunch of people that say, nope, you want to just do 5 or less. And I know I've seen that thing. I see it a lot where you do like 5 or less and you continue to go up. But think about that, you know, those, and I do that with a lot of mine as well, especially when I'm trying to grow muscle strength. But I'm doing 5 at one weight, then going to the next weight, and then the next weight. And I'm still, even with those, getting 30 or more reps in typically. So think about it. Capillary density. How do you achieve that? Johnny Midnight, willpower and mental focus. Oh, yes, paramount. Bobby Levine, since carbs are such an issue, how do you explain the Japanese people who have a low rate of cardiovascular disease in spite of a high carb diet? I don't know how, Bobby. I'm just totally befuddled. Actually, the reality is the Japanese are starting to get into problems as well. And yes, there is that, what's the word? That irony, whatever the term is. Let me just say this, Bobby. I'd much rather somebody give in a little on some carbs, especially some of the more complex carbs like rice, than I would want to see them eat no fat, eat no carbs, but have way too much body fat. Body fat is a critical issue, and in many cases, if not most, it's more important than carbs in the diet. I know I'm going to get a lot of haters for that comment, but I'm telling you what I see. Body fat is a major driver of this problem. Now, if you want to get a little bit deeper in terms of my perspective on body fat, I've done a few videos on a series called The Secret Life of Fat Cells. And so you can look in my channel, The Secret Life of Fat Cells. And basically what we do is we talk about, this was taken from a summary of an award-winning lecture about the science of body fat. And it tells you why body fat is so critically important. Hope that helps, Bobby. James Cantor, the title of the video was good. Oh, well, thank you, James. I appreciate it. For a lot of people, it wasn't exactly clickbait, but some people are interested in that space. JH at Lucien, for older men, would TRT have a place in treatment? Testosterone replacement therapy. I think that we will find, I think they already have found some places for TRT, but it hasn't ended up being what so many people had hoped. You know, the most common hope was that it was going to restore erectile function. That's a vascular issue as well as hormonal, and has not been that much of a breakthrough. Other people wanted it to restore energy, muscle mass, etc., and that's been a little bit better. But when you actually look at the statistics on testosterone clinical trials, the one thing, those things don't end up coming out very well in terms of the evidence. The one thing that does come out, maybe the strongest, and it's still not incredibly powerful, is sleep. It tends to improve sleep. Now think about it. Sleep is critical. If you're one of those people like me who've spent decades waking up at 3 in the morning and not being able to go back to sleep, sleep becomes one of the most important things in life. Johnny Midnight, fantastic question. I guess you were talking about TRT. Luchan P, if LDL isn't the problem, what about LDL particle number? Peter Attia says that LDL particles is what has to be kept low. Yes, so I went through that, Luchan. I hope you picked up on it. I'll repeat maybe a little bit of it at a high level. So what happens is, if we get disrupted carb metabolism, the large, fluffy, healthy LDLs start carrying not cholesterol, but fatty acids. Fatty acid-laden LDL particles get metabolized for energy when they go through the liver. And obvious support of the mechanism that Dave Feldman has when he talks about LDL increasing with low carb for a lot of people, because LDL becomes the boats that carry energy. Now, back to the first digression, the first bunny hole. So if you're chewing up those large, healthy LDL, what's happening with the small dense? You're leaving those there. And if you make up the same level of LDL with small dense particles, you're going to have a lot more particles. So that's why particle count becomes a big issue. As I continue to describe that, one thing you may begin to see is why I start getting to the point where I say, maybe small dense particles aren't the actor. Maybe large fluffy LDLs are not the actor, the protector. Maybe HDL's not the actor, the protector. Maybe these are all just not even firemen. Maybe they're just indicators. Maybe they're the thermometer or speedometer. God's men of America, would carnivore diet reverse cardiovascular disease? I think it does in a lot of people. I think it's, again, I'm going to get a lot of hate comments about that, especially the plant eaters. But think through the logic, and the logic does actually hold. So many people have hidden carb metabolism problems such that carbs do them damage. There are no carbs in meat. Bart, I don't have much regard for Peter Attia, just my opinion. Well, I used to be a bigger Peter Attia fan than I am now, but I'm still a Peter Attia fan. I just don't agree with everything he says. Bobby Ocampo, does gluconeogenesis remove fat in the liver? Does it mean that if you're already low carb and fasting, you should not take metformin and prevent gluconeogenesis? No, that doesn't. No, I would not. I would sort of say yes to the first question and clearly say no to the second. So what happens, even on a low carb diet, you can get glycogen in your liver. Your body can take things like proteins, for sure, amino acids, proteins, and clearly some fatty acids too. They just have to take them through some metabolic gyrations to come back and end up with glycogen in the liver. So yes, metformin still helps even if you're on a low carb diet. Mezzanine, besides the importance for competition, does lactate threshold work? 85 to 90% max for up to 20 minutes have important cardiovascular. Yes, there's no question about that. And we don't talk about that much. I think anything that stimulates, I think both of those stimulate what's the word I'm looking, microvasculature, capillary density of the muscles, of muscle tissue, muscle mass. And here's the other thing they both do as well. I think they both have a significant impact on set point. You remember that very first question we had about set point? You do a lot of work at lactate threshold. And for those of you who don't know what lactate threshold means, it means under that you're burning it, you're burning carbs, you're burning energy, but you're not creating lactic acid. You're not going anaerobic. You're using aerobic mechanisms Once you get into anaerobic mechanisms, you're creating lactate or lactic acid. But the point I was going to make is both lactate threshold and high intensity intervals can impact, I think, have a significant impact on set points, as well as capillary density of muscle tissue. Harvey Ops, HIT, HIIT, academic research, multiple models, the 1 minute workout. Science shows a way to get fit that's smarter, faster, shorter, hardcover, February 7th, 2017, by Martin Gabala, author. Thank you so much, Harvey. I appreciate that. And yes, there's really, really good evidence out there showing how to do it better, farther, better, smarter, faster. Bobby Ocampo, Dom D'Agostino, the South Florida University low carb guy. New research on exogenous ketone salts with MCT on different chronic diseases, including cancer. Any opinion on exogenous? Yeah, I see a lot of discussion about exogenous ketones. I've got an opinion. I started to say it's not that well researched. There's just not a whole lot of research in the space, but the research that I have seen would support my opinion that too many people think I can just take exogenous ketones and that's going to recreate the keto experience for me. And that's just not true. It is not. Now, do exogenous ketones help jumpstart the problem or jumpstart a keto metabolism? Not nearly as much as not eating carbs. You know, this is becoming a litany for me to keep saying. I'm a big fan of people, but I don't agree with everything they say. So I'm a big fan of Dr. Boz, Annette Bosworth. She is doing the Lord's work, helping a lot of people lose significant weight. And yes, this most recent thing about the sardine fast, I think that's a great, great tool. But she sells a lot of exogenous ketones, and she's a much bigger fan of exogenous ketones than I am. Harvey Ops, best water. I am, in my opinion, South Carolina mountain spring water. I'm in Florida. Don't touch the local stuff. Well, as a South Carolina foothills boy, I would say, yeah, that was pretty good water. Bobby Ocampo, any postprandial? Oh my gosh, we have. Oh, okay. So we've got a chat bomber here. His name is Emmanuel Hoke. Okay. He's saying the same thing. Maybe we can cover that once. Okay. Bobby Ocampo, any postprandial insulin spike do you recommend to improve insulin resistance? I don't understand the question, Bobby, but carbs is what causes that spike of both insulin and glucose. Jenny Rule, but just a point. Thank you. You helped me out, and I'm going to turn around and correct you, Bart. I can't help it. I'm sorry. RUHL, Blood Sugar 101. It's a great book. If you haven't read it, do it. Thank you so much, Bart. Raymond Rogers, the 1st of September, I had my aortic valve replaced and part of my ascending aorta replaced because of aneurysm. But now the edema in my legs won't go away. What can I do? Well, you've had a surgeon in there doing some work. I think it's hard to figure out with just that at the other end of the country exactly what's going on with you, Raymond. I think most of us can assume you've got some tissue injury and therefore some edema from that perspective. One of the questions, though, is are you having is it pushing against some edema in terms of left heart failure from that? I think that's really the big question, some level. Bobby Ocampo, and if your doctor tells you you can walk Walking is like, if there's one thing that helps any kind of post-surgery thing, with some rare exceptions, and this might be one of them, so don't take this as medical advice, but if your doctor says you can walk, clearly do it. Bobby Ocampo, if hemoglobin A1C is pre-diabetic range, no need for OGTT, you'll surely fail. Yes, there is a need for OGTT, and here's why. You want to know how insulin resistant you are. If somebody's spikes at 160 at 1 hour post 80 grams, that's very, very different. Or 100 grams, that's very, very different from somebody that spikes at 350 1 hour post. And those are critical differences, Bobby. So pardon me for sort of the in your face giving a different opinion, but that's one of the things that I tend to see a lot. People say, well, if I know I've got a problem, I don't need to know any further. Yes, you do. It's sort of like saying, I know I've got 5 pounds too much weight here, so I don't really need to weigh myself anymore. And it's the same thing as having 350 pounds too much weight. No, it's not. Degree is critical. So when the hemoglobin A1C is in the normal range, we have to verify with OGTT. Now, again, I'm not going to repeat what I just said, but thank you for raising that, because that gives me an opportunity to voice my opinion on that issue. I'm a Newell Hoke. Please tell me ILD, best treatment IPF. Well, gosh, I don't know what ILD and IPF is. Okay, down to Bart. Definitely check out the Meridian tests, Drax of the North. Another great show. Thank you. Thank you, Drax. I appreciate it. Steve Sapel. Good morning, Doc. Have you heard about the drug fenofibrate, which lowers triglycerides, it reduces total and LDL cholesterol, and raises HDL? I have. I don't use those very much. They have a significant, number one, as you can see, they're focused more on the lipids. And the lipids, to me, are usually more of a bioindicator, as we've just been talking during this Q&A session. More of a bioindicator than the actor. And, most other doctors think that cholesterol is the actor. Per Johnson, do glycosamine heal the glycocalyx? That's a good question, because glycosamine is very, very similar. But those are... I don't think there's any significant research. I haven't seen any. If anybody does have any on what heals the glycocalyx, let me know. I think we do know already, just inherently, that it's that same old thing. If you want to get out of a hole, stop digging yourself deeper. The biggest issue is your body will heal, just like your glycocalyx will heal. But not if you're spending 6 and 8 hours a day with a blood sugar of 160 to 180 to 250. That's going to keep chopping it up. Saludos, Leo Acapulco. Good to hear from you. Thank you so much for the comment. Mutant Ryef. Why does various levels of constipation impact blood pressure? Well, it doesn't for everybody. Merlin mutant, but the colon is connected both afferently and efferently. In other words, both going to and coming from the vagus nerve, and the vagus nerve impacts blood pressure. So the vagus nerve is a nerve that it's the opposite of fight or flight. It slows you down and increases vegetative states. It impacts blood pressure as well as colon movement. Steve Sapel, any info on the drug tirzepatide for weight loss? Steve, I did a whole 2-hour video on it. I've got, at least half. You're talking about Mounjaro. I've got a half dozen people on it. So far, they've loved it. By far the most common, most popular drug for weight loss right now is also happens to be a drug that is knocking it out of the park with the CVOT trials, cardiovascular outcome trials. That's because the FDA, in its perhaps late but infinite wisdom, has realized that the big issue with diabetes is not more diabetes. The big issue with diabetes is cardiovascular outcomes, heart attack, stroke, blindness, heart failure, like we talked about today, and the worst, maybe the worst of all, dementia. The one drug that's knocking it out of the park more than any weight loss drug has ever knocked it out of the park is, I call it semaglutide. It's the proper pronunciation is semaglutide, and you find it in oral Rybelsus, which I don't prefer. You find it in Ozempic, which is injected, and in Wegovy, which is injected. Those are so popular right now. The maker, Novo Nordisk, can't keep up with the demand. There's a lot of attention, a lot of articles on that space right now. Why did I go down that bunny hole, and what's that got to do with tirzepatide? Well, it's an incretin, meaning it's a hormone made by the intestines, and the hormone tells the stomach to shut down, don't empty more into us right now. It also tells the pancreas to get ready for blood sugar spike. And it really is saving lives from prevented cardiovascular events, CVOT trials. Tirzepatide is a twincretin, not an incretin, a twincretin. And the reason it got that name twincretin is that it's got two different incretin mechanisms, not just the one. And guess what? It's coming out of the blocks appearing to be about twice as good as Ozempic, or twice as effective. It's a big deal. And the people that I'm using it with appear to be tolerating it very well. Bruce Nichols, advice on finding or selecting a real doctor. I'm sorry, but I can't help but say, I'm still taking patients. I'm not going to be taking a lot of patients for very long because our physician network is growing. And I will say this, as we grow the network, we are going to be having more doctors within the network that can do the kind of stuff that you're talking about. Steve Sapel, how about the drug olpasiran? Are you telling me that that's going to be interesting? There's a new set of drugs called antisense drugs that are just knocking it out of the park with Lp(a). I didn't know they had hit the market yet. It's olpasiran. I'll have to look that up. Pardon me, I'm going to make a quick note. If the antisense drugs have made it to the market, and that's one of them, I think that's going to be a very interesting development. Docivity, doesn't testosterone replacement therapy have too many risks? No, it doesn't. That's a really, really good point, Docivity. Thank you so much for bringing it up. It was, 4 or 5 years ago, a really definitive set of randomized clinical trials came up on testosterone therapy. Many people, myself included, expected to see some significant risks. They didn't appear. So testosterone therapy is safer than you think. It is, however, still a controlled drug in most states, and that's for that reason. I don't use it. I don't prescribe it. I have a lot of patients that are on it, but they get it from other providers. Rick Folia, craft warning, got my kit, did the test, noticed the bottle said 50 grams, had to get a new kit and redo the whole test with the correct 100 bottles. So check the bottle before doing the test. Thank you, Rick. That's interesting. And I made it all the way through today. For those of you who are still here, thank you so much.